delighted to be here and to talk to you. Ordinarily, when I give my talks, I tell lots of stories about patients. But I actually get to have a patient tell his story. And so I'm going to turn this over to my very good friend and a patient of mine, Jim Riswold.
And then I will turn it over to a very good friend of mine and a man who saved my life. But first, I have a warning. That aside, I thought this was going to be a really easy talk, even though I am scared up here. I was going to talk about getting leukemia 10 years ago and being told I had 2 to 4 years to live. I was going to talk about how after my diagnosis, I retired from Wieden+Kennedy after 22 years because I didn't want "Here lies the guy that did the bow-nose commercial" on my tombstone, and jumped into the art world as a self-proclaimed fake artist and went on, or as I like to say, went on from a career of selling things that people don't need to making things that people don't want. I was going to talk about how much it didn't matter how much I sucked as a fake artist because I had a really good chance of being dead before any critic's words could hurt my feelings. And as I've done before, I was going to talk about how Adolf Hitler saved my life. Yes, of course, the least nice man in history had substantial help from one of the nicest men in history, and Gleevec. Now, I know the Fuhrer makes an unlikely savior, raises some pesky ethical questions, but this was art, and Hitler and a few of his cronies were responsible for World War II and all its attendant unpleasantness, formed the basis of my first show, Goring's Lunch. It featured such pieces as the Hitlermobile, Goring's Lunch, Himmler's Homework, Goebbels' Chair, Heydrich's Skateboard, Rome's Roses, and many offensive others. But Willamette Week named it one of the best shows of 2005. The Hitlermobile was selected for the 2006 Northwest Biennial. My sons and daughters' school asked me to, quote, do something like my Hitler art, but without Hitler, to raise money for their school. Not everyone was pleased. At the opening of Goring's Lunch, someone told my daughter, Hallie, your dad has some serious issues. The Northwest Biennial received so many complaints, they had to hand employees talking points about the Hitlermobile. I myself offered to come up and cover it with Hello Kitty stickers. But it was a fucking good story. Or at least Esquire thought so. They published it in 2005. Again, not everyone was pleased. 2 advertisers asked for their money back. But I went on to make more shows about more of history's bullies. I did a show about Napoleon. That's his hat. That's him going to heaven. The French really thought he went to heaven. I did a show about Mao called Mao Home and Garden. Heart country. Bad show called Bad People Have to Eat Too. Small Caesar salad. And Adolf and Eva's wedding cake. And by the way, today is the day that Hitler killed himself. And Marie Antoinette's head and other. Coupe-ci means cut here in French. I like to call my work absurd realism. Others call it perverse whimsy. Still others call it a black hole sucking the life out of everything. But a really smart philosophy professor said my work teaches us how to deal with monsters, be it a Hitler or a deadly disease. But my mom asks, son, what does all this hullabaloo about Hitler mean? Well, Mom, as you know, I grew up a 98-pound weakling. In elementary school, Johnny Tresnowski beat the shit out of me every day. In junior high school, Phil Keller took over for Johnny Tresnowski. In high school, Bob Newell took over for Phil Keller. But somewhere between Bob Newell's beatings, I came to the conclusion, despite my best efforts and a modest weight gain, that I was always remained low on the He-Man food chain. Trouble was, I really did want to fight back. I'd pray every night, "Dear Jesus, please help me kick Bob Newell's ass." It didn't work. Bob Newell prayed harder. "Dear Jesus, please help me kick Jim Riswold's ass more than I did today." Amen. But somewhere between Newell's beatings, a couple things happened. I read some authors named, oops, that's my mom. I forgot that slide. She was hot. I read some authors named UNESCO, Swift, and Voltaire, and I learned some new words like satire, sarcasm, sardonic wit, and hubris. And I discovered the joyous, absurdist wit of Monty Python. I did some funny math and learned something from the strange tonics of rhinoceroses, modest proposals, panglosses, and some very funny jokes about the very unfunny Spanish Inquisition. I learned to laugh at the bad guy. And I'll let you in on a little secret. Bad guys don't like to be laughed at. That's what makes them bad guys. They take themselves very seriously. However, we are told not to laugh at these people. Mocking them, laughing at them, satirizing them, we are told, trivializes their crimes. I think I disagree. I would argue that only speaking about the Hitlers in the world in deadly serious tones pays these fools the reverence that they crave. They don't mind being called monsters, but they sure as hell don't like being called fools. Voltaire said, "I have never made but one prayer to God, a very short one. O Lord, please make my enemies look ridiculous." Research says that some good will come of this. Once I started mocking Bob Newell and his pugilist ways, he lost interest in beating me to a pulp. Go figure. I think he stopped his bullying because I no longer paid him the reverence of fear. Yes, it all would have made for a fabulously interesting, if not slightly offensive story. Fake artist and Brian Druker saved my life. It would be perfect for TED until I got cancer again. I thought cancer was like dessert. You only got one. I thought wrong. My second bout with cancer started innocently enough with a barred biopsy gun loaded with 18-gauge needles shoved up my ass. It would prove to be a trifle compared to, how shall I put this, the adventures me and my ass and the rest of me would experience over the next few days. Those adventures would include, but were far from limited to, 2 trips to the ER, one of which included a 3.5-hour stay on the floor of the ER, vomiting on a beautiful woman, a lost dog, Schrodinger's cat, 2 strains of E. coli, near asphyxiation, lots of blood, cribbage, Keith Richards, a 4-day stay in the hospital with a hillbilly roommate who liked his TV loud and his belching louder, and being spoon-fed by a beautiful woman clad only in panties and 6-inch heels. Yes, the same one I had vomited on earlier. And the start of my second tussle with cancer when Brian visited me in the hospital and told me that I had prostate cancer. I didn't think I was old enough for that. It was decided that the best course of treatment would be to have it removed. Surgery was scheduled for the 23rd of February. It was supposed to be a relatively simple surgery involving the Da Vinci robot. 4 little scars, some unpleasant but short-term side effects such as temporary urinary incontinence and impotence. Yes, I said that word. In the latter's case, temporary, meaning anywhere from 3 to 18 months, and I would be out of the hospital in a day or 2. Things did not go according to plan. To put it mildly, I had surgical complications, like almost dying. The night after my relatively simple surgery, I woke up in the middle of the night in the worst pain I had ever experienced. My abdomen was the size of 2 footballs. My blood pressure was in the low 50s over something. My heart rate is 170 over something. They raced me to the ICU. I am bleeding internally, one hell of a lot. Worst thing, I have to give up a hospital room so fancy it should have been featured at Better Homes and Garden. It even had a fireplace. Long story short, the next 12 hours of my life include IVs, transfusions, injection, PICC lines, oxygen masks, a whole lot of morphine, hearing things like I can't get a pulse, an eager cleaning lady, my parents in tears, and the general chaos that comes from the ICU trying to prevent someone such as myself from lapsing into a coma, and an overeager urology student who comes into my room and decides to fiddle with my catheter. The fiddling, despite the morphine, hurts, and I not so politely asked the student, I'm trying to lapse into a coma here, and you're giving me a hand job? After my hand job, they decided to send me back to surgery. They removed 9 liters of blood from my abdomen. They saved my life. A vein had been cut. I spent another week in the hospital feasting on popsicles and morphine while recovering from the second surgery. My body is a collection of unsightly bruises, staples, scars, tubes, bandages, catheters, and piping hot bags of piss. A friend says I look like I swallowed a grenade. I leave the hospital a mess, both physically and mentally. Things get worse when I wake up one morning and my catheter had broke, and I'd been sleeping in my own urine and blood. I completely lose it. This is not what I signed up for. Brian and some other friends calm me down. I deal with it by having my good photographer and good friend Ray Gordon shoot my body in all its brokenness. In other words, I tell cancer to go himself. I lose the fear of what has happened to my body. I lose the fear of the side effects of temporary, hopefully very temporary, urinary incontinence and impotence. I lose my fear of cancer. Hell, let's go for a trifecta. Bring on a third. But it also gives me optimism. It gives me the hope that my stories and these photos will give prostate cancer the attention it lacks but deserves. Maybe it will even get a baseball bat of its own in its own special color. Trust me, it is not a second-rate cancer. It can rob a man both mentally and physically of his sexuality, just as breast cancer can a woman. It gives me the justified belief that as unbelievably upside down, extraordinary as my biopsy and surgery were, my sexual recovery will be every bit as right up extraordinary. In fact, I expect nothing less than to utter the words Millard Fillmore and get an erection the size of his home state of New York. Millard Fillmore! All together with me, please. Millard Fillmore! Louder, please. Millard Fillmore! I think it moved. Thank you.
Well, I'm taking one for the team by going after that. As I was putting my finishing touches on my talk last night, my wife asked me, "Are you nervous?" And I said, "Well, yeah, a little bit. It's a big audience. It's a big scene." She said, "Well, you shouldn't be." And I said, "Well, why?" She said, "After Jim shows his pictures, nobody's going to remember anything else anybody says today." But what I want to talk about are a couple things. First of all, one of the things I have the extraordinary opportunity is, as a physician, is to learn from my patients. and to listen to them. And what I learned from Jim is how somebody deals with an illness and how somebody deals with a devastating illness like cancer. Fortunately, there's only one Jim Riswold who has such a dark sense of humor, but it is about turning the experience of cancer into something that's positive in his life, and Jim has certainly done that through extraordinary difficulties. But what all of us want to do is always want to change the way we look at cancer and change the game of how we treat cancer. And that was certainly my motivation. 18 years ago, I was at a crossroads in my career. I was a young scientist looking to start my own laboratory. At the time, I was at Harvard's Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where I had completed my training in oncology. And I had spent 7 years in a laboratory understanding the science of cancer. And I was looking to begin my own laboratory. I had a view that there was a different way of treating cancer, and that different way was by targeting cancer cells without harming normal cells. But in order to do that, we needed to understand what was driving the growth of cancer. Now, I have to tell you, 18 years ago, that was not exactly considered standard scientific method. In fact, some people even consider that voodoo science. When I went to meet with the head of Dana-Farber Cancer Institute to ask for a laboratory and a promotion, he basically told me that I had no future. Now, at that point, I had a decision to make. Was I going to listen to this person, or was I going to believe in myself? Was I going to live up to the promise I had made to my patients to find a better way to treat their cancer, or was I going to go and take a cushy job doing the same thing that everybody else was doing? And as a patient who I met with yesterday told me, sometimes you got to get slapped in the face or knocked in the head to wake yourself up, and to get that courage and that motivation to do something that's different, and to get some focus. And what that event did is it allowed me to get some focus. I knew that I needed a lab. I knew that I needed some space. I found my way to OHSU into Oregon, where I found that person in Grover Bagby who gave me a position and believed in me. Within 6 weeks of arriving here, I began to work on my goal, and that was one goal, to find a drug that worked against the model systems of leukemia that I'd set up in my lab, and to get a drug that attacked that leukemia into the clinic. Within 6 weeks of arriving here, I was working with a compound that killed leukemia cells without harming normal cells. And I knew that I had something that was quite different than anybody else had ever seen. Now, it should have been simple. It should have been really easy to get that drug from the laboratory into the clinic, but it wasn't. The drug company who owned the drug had virtually no interest in moving that drug forward. And there were 3 problems they saw with it. First of all, they weren't convinced that it would work. Second of all, they were convinced that it would be extraordinarily toxic. And third, when they did their market survey, they actually thought that it was never going to be worth the investment. They'd never see a return on the investment and the development costs. Even my future wife, who was at that time a journalist and came to interview me about some of the preclinical data, said that drug wasn't going anywhere either. As she now says, nice guy, really good with patients for a researcher, but that drug, it's not going to make it. And that, for me, started a 5-year crusade to get this drug into the clinic. I wasn't just a researcher. I was also a doctor who had patients who needed this life-saving medication desperately. And even though some people who I had great respect from had deserted me, there was one group of people who never did, and those were my patients. Those patients put their faith in me, and this was another crossroads in my career. Those patients' faith emboldened me to take on one of the biggest drug companies in the world and move this drug into clinical trials. And in 1998, we started clinical trials, and within 6 months, every single one of our patients had their blood counts returned to normal with a once-a-day pill, and they had minimal side effects. Three years later, this drug received FDA approval. That was May of 2001, now 10 years ago. And it still holds a record for the fastest FDA approval of a drug in the history of the FDA. Now, 10 years later, we know that a disease that once had a 3 to 5 year life expectancy has a 95% 5-year survival. But more importantly, what this drug has done is it showed cancer doctors what we can accomplish if we understand what drives the growth of cancer. We can develop drugs that are like magic bullets in this war against cancer. But to understand how this works, I'm going to give you an analogy of a thermostat. And if you think about how a thermostat regulates the temperature in a room between 68 and 72, the temperature falls below 68, thermostat kicks on, warms the room up to 72. Perfect temperature regulation. Our bodies have thermostats. And every day we're required to replace cells in our body. If we need more cells, thermostat kicks on, some cells grow, enough cells are present, the thermostat kicks off. Perfect regulation. Now imagine our thermostat is broken and the temperature, the thermostat's stuck on, the temperature climbs 72, 80, 90, and continues on through the roof. That's what happens in cancer. A cell is stuck on, the thermostat is stuck on, telling cells to grow and grow and grow, and that's a tumor. So how are we going to fix that? Well, we could bang the thermostat with a hammer. We don't know how that works. It's kind of like chemotherapy. It leaves our patients bruised and battered. Now imagine if we could take that thermostat apart, piece by piece, and just replace the broken part. Sounds really simple and really obvious. That's exactly what we did with Gleevec. We understood what was driving the growth of this particular leukemia. We developed a drug to shut down this cancer, and we've disabled the cancer without disabling the patient. So now here we are 10 years later. Some of the things that we're doing at the Knight Cancer Institute is we can survey cancers for hundreds of molecular abnormalities that drive their growth, and we can use that information to match patients with the right drug. And there are over 200 of these targeted agents in clinical trials now, and hundreds more in development. And that's what gives us optimism that we truly can change the game against cancer. It started with one drug, with Gleevec. That revolution started right here in Oregon. And our view is with support from Phil and Penny Knight, from other supporters in our community, that we truly can finish the job and change the game as we try to defeat cancer. But as I finish, what I really want to do is I want to pay tribute to all these many patients who went on this journey with me. These patients who put their faith in me. And these are patients who are now, many of them 10 or 12 years into therapy. On the top left, a patient who is the very first patient, or the longest patient, continues on therapy, 12 years on therapy. A woman on the bottom, spending time with her grandchildren. Her two children, older children, have now grown up and given her 3 great-grandchildren. Many patients making their way along the Oregon Trail for our clinical trials. The very first patient on the upper right from Italy, doing something he absolutely enjoys, dancing. And a patient in the middle, one of the first patients treated from Australia. She returned to Australia and carried the torch for the Olympic Games in Sydney. But the extraordinary thing, again, about dealing with patients is what you learn from them. And the most important lesson I've learned from patients is the greatest gift that you can give patients is the gift of hope. And for me, the gift that I want to leave you today is that I'm hoping that we will see far more pictures like this last picture, if you could bring it up, of many, many patients surviving and thriving despite a diagnosis of cancer. Thank you very much.